Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore a topic that was suggested by a viewer whose name I will probably mispronounce horribly, and it's Harmanveer Randawa. Basically, Harmanveer Randawa asks, how do we locate our best path in life, and relatedly, how do we know whether we're really on it? Which I think is an excellent question, but also a very tricky one. Anyhow, here's a roadmap of the material in this video, and as always, to enhance your viewing pleasure and general sense of edification, you can find this same roadmap in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Yeah, so how do we locate our best path in life, and how do we know whether we're really on it? And like I said, I think that's an excellent question, but a pretty tricky one. On one level, what makes it tricky is the degree of individual variability in our optimal life paths and how we find them. And because of that, a life path that easily suits one person may or may not suit the next. But beyond that, the process of discovering our paths often also varies a lot from person to person. Some of us struggle a lot with that question throughout our entire lives and have to go through quite a bit of self-doubt and experimentation before we finally settle on the life that we really want to live. For other people, the answer seems relatively straightforward, and life is mostly a matter of fulfilling a fairly obvious destiny. Personally, I would say that I'm mostly in the former category, and it's only been through decades of trial and error that I've finally settled on a more or less stable path. So probably most of the material in this video will be directed toward those of us who are genuinely struggling with the question, and not so much toward people for whom it's not really an issue in the first place. Anyhow, beyond the whole issue of individual variability, I suspect that another part of what makes the question so tricky is that most of the time we discover our best path in hindsight, which is to say, when we look back on our lives. That's partly because human existence inevitably involves experiencing a fair number of disappointments and reversals. And at difficult times like those, it can easily seem like we're being deflected and pushed away from whatever our optimal path in life is. But personally, I've discovered that practically all of the moments that seem to push us away from our better destinies actually end up being part of some much larger arc that ultimately leads us to where we really needed to go all along. All of which is very difficult to predict ahead of time. However, in the immediate present, we tend to think we know where life should be taking us. But the problem is that, well, it's very easy to be completely wrong about that. And because life is basically a capricious and unpredictable thing a lot of the time, the fact is that we don't really know where it's going to take us or what the consequences of it will be, especially with regard to what we think of as our best path. So personally, over time I've come to recognize that I actually know very little about what my best path in life is beforehand, or even when it's actually happening, because making that sort of evaluation happens mostly in retrospect, when we can see things in a much broader and encompassing way than usual. And ultimately, that's because life doesn't necessarily take us where we want to go. Instead, it takes us where we need to go. And when we think about our best paths, it's usually more in terms of the former than the latter, which of course is already a misdirection a lot of the time. But on the other hand, if we were to focus our attention a little bit more on where we need to go, probably we would discover that we're already on our best paths, even if it doesn't particularly seem like it. And all of that probably sounds fairly reasonable, I'm guessing. But the fact is that there's still a pretty big problem. Even if it's the case that we understand our optimal path primarily by looking into the past, the fact is that we have to live in the present. And so the fundamental question still remains. What can we do about the question of our best path in the here and now? Basically, with respect to life as we currently know it. After all, For most of us, it doesn't seem particularly satisfying just to wait for some indefinite point in the future when the greater coherence of our existence will finally be revealed to us. We also have to make concrete decisions about our lives in the here and now. So, even if our present perception of our best path is prone to all sorts of mistakes and misdirections, and our decisions consequently have to be based upon a certain degree of guesswork and approximation, the question still remains. What can we do to find a way of sensing our deeper destiny that will help us make reasonably good practical life decisions despite all of the difficulties involved? And in that regard, which I suspect is the most important part of the question, I'd like to talk for a minute about a couple ideas that come to us by way of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And more specifically, I'd like to talk about his distinction between authentic existence and inauthentic existence. And by the way, if you want a more expansive treatment of Heidegger's philosophy, I'll put some links to some older videos I've made about it. But for the purposes of this video, let me just mention a few of his ideas in a fairly loose and non-technical way. First, according to Heidegger, the main way we move through life is simply by conforming to the people around us, mostly by the dynamics of imitation and obedience. In other words, most of the time, we're pretty much living according to other people's paradigms. For instance, we frequently adopt variations of their habits and values as our own. We think mostly like they do. We feel mostly like they do. We dress and behave more or less like they do. You're probably starting to get the picture. Basically, for the most part, what we end up doing with a fairly large fraction of our lives is living other people's lives rather than our own. Heidegger calls that inauthenticity or inauthentic existence, and he describes it in terms of our being lost in the they, or das Man in German. On the other hand, it's always possible for us to experience what he calls authenticity. Heidegger's way of describing authenticity or authentic existence is in terms of living toward our, quote, ownmost potentiality for being. In other words, the possibilities in this life that are most uniquely and most distinctly our own. Basically, at some point in our humdrum everyday existence, it's always possible for us to stop living out other people's lives for them and instead begin to, quote, choose ourselves, as he says, and in the process take the reins of our greater destiny in our own hands, and then, however timorously, begin to move toward what we truly can be in this world. And all of that probably sounds pretty good. After all, in our final dying moments, when the sun's glimmering rays are fading fast from our sight, and we finally pause, quivering and trembling on the brink of the infinite unknown, who among us would really feel good about having lived mostly someone else's life, mostly other people's desires and designs, and hardly ever our own? And in that delicate and terrifying moment of balance, when we find ourselves suspended somewhere between life and death, who among us would truly be content in the knowledge that almost all we'd ever been in this life was other people's glorified lackey and slave? Imagine it. Imagine never knowing what it's like to become the artist and architect of your own existence, never knowing what it really feels like to inscribe your own unique song in the living book of this world, never to be the poet, never the rhapsode, and never the lover reveling in all of the sublime ecstasy of our brief and uncertain stay in this land. And as I'm saying this, I'm hoping you're starting to feel a little bit queasy, and maybe a little bit horrified too, because that repellent reaction might start to provide us, or at least some of us, with a possible way of navigating our lives in the present. That's because it seems to me that part of finding our better destinies has to do with sculpting away all of the cheap and easy answers to life's riddle. You know, things like, just do what everyone else is doing. Just keep producing and consuming, and hoping for a little entertainment on the weekend. And never question it, never look for anything deeper. And by the way, while you're at it, just keep doing what you're told. You know, just like the guards at Treblinka did. Let that be the model for your time on planet Earth. And along the way, never take any real chances in your life either. Never be brave enough or bold enough or daring enough to take even a single dangerous original step in this world. Never learn to fly, especially on the wings of what you really are. Always stay safe. Always limit yourself to saying and thinking and doing the most appropriate and inoffensive and pusillanimous things whenever possible. And if you adopt that paradigm for your life as your own, your reward, your great reward, will be that you'll eventually slip comfortably into your grave with a big, dumbass, properly narcotized smile on your face. Woohoo! I mean, think about it, like, seriously. How many times have you been told that in one subtle way or another? How many times have you been sold a cheap and counterfeit story to disguise the real depth of your soul? And if you're anything like me, God forbid, I bet it's been a lot. Well, maybe at some point, and maybe at some bold and brilliant point in our lives, shining like a star on the distant horizon, life is actually calling us to sculpt away all of that kind of nonsense, which, by the way, we tend to take way too seriously, and then gradually learn to drop the mountains of onerous and debilitating baggage we've been lugging around, which, surprise, is actually mostly other people's baggage. Anyhow, the point I'm really trying to make is that maybe part of finding our way in life involves a subtractive process that mostly has to do with getting rid of what's encumbering us. A negative process, if you will, that will eventually leave us with nothing but a truly radiant and vibrant destiny. So maybe the question isn't so much about what we can do to find our best path in life. Maybe it's more about how we can cut away what's debilitating and inhibiting us so that we can eventually begin to perceive the subtleties of our best path with relative clarity. However, drawing out the implications of Heidegger's analysis, which we've been doing for several minutes now, still leaves us with a problem, and it has to do with that somewhat antiquated word, ownmost, as in the formula of our ownmost potentiality for being. Basically, the question is, what is the, quote, own that would seem to define our ownmost? In other words, who are we really, such that we might have some sense of what our ownmost would mean in the first place? And the reason that's a problem is that when you think about it, who we seem to be on the surface is probably thoroughly suffused with who we've been told we are throughout our lives, along with what we've been told we have to be. And consequently, who we think we are is probably largely a bricolage of different values and habits and scraps of factual information we've received from other people, which isn't necessarily indicative of who we are in our depths. And because of that, it's not necessarily an easy thing to distinguish who we really are from how other people have defined us. For instance, am I really Eric Dodson? Well, I guess the obvious answer would be, yeah, of course. Just look on your driver's license or birth certificate if you're a little bit confused. But is that really true? Or is it more the case that the name Eric Dodson is really just a label someone handed me at some point in the past? And yeah, I've certainly come to identify with that label over time, but that doesn't actually mean that it defines me. Maybe the deeper reality is that underneath it all, I'm actually nameless and beyond category altogether. And maybe you are too. Or, to put it another way, any name we adopt as anything other than a joke is already a way of misnaming ourselves and misrecognizing who we actually are. Okay, well then. Am I really a college professor, as though that designation were somehow determining my being? Or is it mostly just a way of describing the niche I occupy right now within the socioeconomic pecking order? All right, well, probably at this point you're starting to get the picture. So, the main point is that the question of our best path in life is probably integrally related to the question of who we really are. Because without some sense of who we really are, it's pretty easy to mistake someone else's life for our own, and then skip blithely down the primrose path of inauthentic existence. La-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. But part of what makes that a difficult question is not just that who we are is always tangled up with how other people are defining us. Beyond that, the issue is that who we really are isn't actually a stationary target. Instead, it's something that's constantly shifting and changing as we ourselves grow and develop over time. And if that's not enough, well, consider the fact that one of the things in this world that's powerful enough to change who we really are is the experience of realizing who we really are. So, if you think you know who you are, probably you're already mistaken, because you're probably already becoming something else. And in light of all of those sorts of difficulties, it can easily seem like a futile and fruitless task to come to a reasonably solid sense about who we are, especially since who we are isn't anything solid in the first place. But actually, all it really takes is developing a much more fluid and adaptable sense for what we think of as our identities. In other words, the question isn't so much, who are we? But rather, who are we becoming? Or maybe better yet, how are we passing beyond ourselves? And here we come to the real crux of the whole issue of finding our better paths, and it has to do with cultivating self-awareness, which in turn has to do with developing a kind of receptivity and sensitivity at the deepest levels of our consciousness. That's because only when our consciousness has become reasonably sensitive and receptive to reality can we become aware of both who we are as well as our better destinies. Otherwise, our only real alternative is to continue flailing about in the dark. So then the question naturally becomes, well, how can we develop that kind of consciousness? And as I've mentioned probably too many times in these videos, for me, one of the best ways has been through practicing meditation. The reason is that meditation, at least of the type that I practice, is about learning to inhabit the moments of our lives more fully and more faithfully, with fewer distortions and obscurations, as Buddhists like to say. It's about learning how to empty ourselves of all of the clutter and clatter that normally fills our lives and clouds our perceptions. Because as long as our consciousness is filled with distractions, life will never be able to leave its impress upon us. We'll never be able to hear the questions that life is actually asking us. And so our better destinies will always remain elusive and incomprehensible to us. So I'd say that what most of us need, especially in the West, is a kind of practice, and it doesn't necessarily have to be meditation, but a practice that allows us to develop a clarity of mind, especially since our world does pretty much everything possible to keep that from happening. And clarity of mind is ultimately about, well, it's ultimately about learning what silence is like. Not just silence in its literal sense, which is probably already pretty challenging, but more specifically, a silence of our minds, our hearts, and ultimately our souls. Of course, I realize that in our modern world, silence, and by that I mean real silence, is a fairly scary thing. Mostly because of how easy it is to become thoroughly addicted to all of the din and distraction our world is constantly generating for us. But on the other hand, well, what is life if not an opportunity to face our fears and then move beyond them? So maybe at the end of the day, when we ask about our optimal path in life, the best practical advice I'd have to offer would be something like, silence will fall when the question is asked. And that might be a little bit of an Easter egg for some of you out there. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching. It's good to be in the universe with you. And as always, take care of your soul.